I'm really quite sore today. I was playing pickleball yesterday, which is a brand new sport. Not a whole lot of people have heard of it. Actually, I take that back. There's a ton of people that have heard of it. They just happen to all be seniors and 60 years plus. But I love the game. It's really fun. It's kind of like a mix between badminton and tennis.
Well, let's start with question number one. From score of 0 to 10, with 10 being the worst pain you've ever felt. How bad is your pain today?
Yeah, I'd probably give it like a 7.
Okay. And which arm do you use to play pickleball with?
Mostly right hand.
Okay, and how would you say that the range of motion is on your shoulder? How many degrees of rotation can you get there?
Wouldn't it be amazing, Josh, if we could collect this kind of information all the time from, not just people like myself going out and playing a sport, but actually getting it from patients after a surgery, let's say, and quantifying this data.
So you're saying instead of just the outcomes being reported by clinicians, you're saying what if patients could report outcomes?
Exactly. Excellent. We made it.
Great idea.
Last week, we were talking about, conducting research on digital patient engagement. And we touched on the topic of patient-reported outcomes because that's a huge component of what digital patient engagement allows for, is collecting these outcomes from patients and collecting the patient voice. And so we figured, that's a topic in itself, and why not take the time today to really dig into the power of patient-reported outcomes on digital patient engagement platforms. What do you think, Josh? Is this a good episode?
I think that's a great idea. Let's get into it.
Okay, awesome. Do you need a minute to get set up, or you're good?
No, I'm good. Let's go for it.
Okay, awesome. So where I thought maybe we could start is if you wanted to give maybe a bit of a background on patient-reported outcomes. For example, why is the patient voice important to capture for healthcare, but surgeries maybe specifically, or other use cases as you see fit?
Yeah, I think healthcare has been pretty good in general at measuring things. We do a pretty good job at capturing a number of different clinical outcome metrics. So lots of work being done on tracking outcomes such as length of stay, readmission rates, infection rates, and other complication rates, readmissions, ER visit rates, mortality rates. So we collect all kinds of metrics and clinical outcomes, and we've been doing that for decades. But I think one of the things that's transpired in the last several decades, particularly given that patients are living longer, and healthcare is becoming more and more patient-centric. And I think now the term people are using is maybe patients as consumers, and making it more consumer-centric is how do we actually measure outcomes that patients really care about? Because as much as healthcare providers, really care about clinical outcomes, and as much as we assume patients would care about a lot of these clinical outcomes as well, when you talk to patients, you find that often their goals for their own healthcare are sometimes quite different. So, imagine a patient who has knee arthritis, they're 75 years old, and they're going to need a knee replacement surgery. And if you were to ask, historically, the surgeon, well, what's a great outcome for a patient? In the past, they might have told you things such as, well, if we can avoid complications, avoid a joint infection, avoid a readmission, avoid, a death, those would be important things. But then if you ever asked a 75-year-old, maybe grandmother of several kids, what's important to her as part of her journey, having, improvements in her knee, she might tell you things such as, well, I want to have less pain, or I want to be able to do certain activities again, or I want to walk my granddaughter down the aisle. And so there's all these other outcomes that patients tend to care about. And for a long time, we didn't capture their voice in this process. And I think patient-reported outcomes have been transformative for healthcare and bring the patient voice back into how we measure how well we deliver healthcare.
Definitely. And I think, in today's world, we're catching up to that. Payers are incentivizing providers, like you mentioned, with a knee replacement, collecting validated surveys like the HOOS survey or the KOOS survey is now being tied into reimbursement. What would you say are some of the limitations behind collecting these and capturing these patient-reported outcomes today?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we've done a pretty good job, in healthcare to start collecting patient-reported outcomes for, probably the last, I want to say, maybe 10 to 20 years, particularly pretty good in the last 10 years. But a lot of the validated patient-reported outcome surveys that are administered, so the HOOS and KOOS in total joint replacement, things like the VR12, the PROMIS-10, the EQ5D. There's also like these more general quality of life survey measures, and there's a host of other specific survey tools for different healthcare conditions and surgeries. But one of the limitations historically is that these surveys were being collected at very few time points in a patient journey. So often we would collect these, let's say, a few weeks, let's say for a surgery, a few weeks pre-op, we'd collect some maybe 30 days post-op, maybe again at 3 months, 6 months, 12 months post-op. So maybe anywhere between 2 and 4 time points in that patient journey, we would collect these patient-reported outcomes, which is better than nothing, Alan. But if you think about the fact that there's so many days in between the start and finish of an episode, just imagine how many data points we're missing that could really help us understand the real patient experience. But I mean, given that usually we were expecting patients to fill out surveys in the waiting room, or maybe we were calling patients to fill out surveys, you can understand why organizations and providers weren't collecting daily patient data. No one was going to call a patient every day just to have them answer 10 or 20 question surveys. Just wasn't feasible.
And oftentimes, those questions would be repeated. So it might be like, day one, and then if you were to ask them again on the second day, it might be the exact same set of questions. And after, a certain number of days, patients aren't going to necessarily want to keep answering those same questions, especially let's say their pain is down to 0. By that point, they're not going to keep, engaged with that.
Yeah, or even like imagine you do, thousands or tens of thousands of patient journeys every year. How many staff members would it take to hire to call every single one of those patients, for 12 months straight? I mean,
Totally.
you're not going to do that scalably.
It's definitely not scalable for that. And then I think, they then would send out the surveys in the mail or something like that, but the response rates were never great. And that's obviously a limitation.
I mean, the lift on that, I mean, when people talk about, things like HCAP surveys and patient satisfaction surveys, the response rates are so low. I mean, the friction you have where you have to get the envelope, open it up, bubble in a bunch of things, then, find a mailbox, mail it back in. I mean, like the amount of effort it takes, and what's the value to the patient filling these out?
I think that's the one of the most important parts there is there value for the patient?
What do they get? It's like, why are they going to not only fill this out, but then put it back in the mailbox for you? Or why is a patient going to come visit you 6 months after the surgery just to fill out a survey? Why would they do that? What if they live 3 hours away?
Right.
What if it's COVID-19? Who's going to come back in just to fill out a survey? It's just not feasible right now to expect patients to do these things when it's not clear what value they're going to get, frankly, from giving this data back. So as much as we want to collect these things, we've got to make it easy and we've got to make it valuable for patients.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you've kind of hinted at a potential solution and the solution that we're positioned as. Why would you say digital is better for collecting patient-reported outcomes?
Yeah, well, one is, I mean, as much as this shouldn't be the right answer, the truth is that our healthcare providers are busy, and I think for one, the fact that we can use digital platforms to automate sending these patient-reported outcome surveys to patients is a huge one. I mean, the fact that without even having to inform a provider that a survey is going out, it just goes on its own, and then and we can prompt the patient, and we can use text, we can use email, we can prompt them in an application on their phone. I mean, it just saves staff so much time.
Mhm.
I mean, the stories I hear, Alan, about like phone tag. Imagine you're a research coordinator or nurse manager, and you call a patient and you go to voicemail, and then you have to call them again later. You have to keep track of that. It's
Mhm.
asking for a lot on top of
Spreadsheeting it.
responsibilities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And keeping in mind you have, 10,000 patients that you have to collect these scores from. It's going to
Oh
take a
yeah,
lifetime. Yeah.
you gotta be on the phone. You gotta actually write down their answers. Maybe you can port that into a database later. It's just like it's insane the amount of work
Yeah.
you have to do.
Absolutely. So collecting patient-reported outcomes digitally, and not just I'm not just talking about like a digital patient engagement, like even just any means through digital is through a website, through a presumably an HIPAA compliant method. We're able to collect scores from patients remotely, so that's one benefit. They don't have to drive that 3 hours to get back to the
Yeah, that's
hospital.
the thing. The
You know,
patient doesn't have to come in. Yeah.
and especially at those timestamps, like 6 months after their procedure, when they're not even thinking about that anymore. You can at least get the survey in front of them digitally. And then coming back to the point you made about what's the value for patients. So what kind of value are they actually getting from filling out this survey, for instance? And so this is where I did want to talk about digital patient engagement and like for instance SeamlessMD in general in this space, because patients are interacting with the platform on a day-to-day basis even before collecting these patient reported outcomes. This is a solution that's designed to help guide the patient from before their surgery, if it's a surgery intervention, all the way through their surgery and afterwards. So they're getting value the entire time through education, through reminders, through basically every form of content that they're interacting with on the system throughout the episode. And then on top of that, the platform's then going to put in, here's a survey for a patient reported outcome, and patients are able to interact with the platform at that point. So they've already gotten value from the system, and now they're going to be giving back through these patient reported outcomes. So I think that's what you were mentioning about what's the value for patients, and how can we make that better and more effective for patients.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I mean, you can imagine a patient where if all you did was just annoy them with a survey every 30 days, like, why would they do it? But to your point, what we find on our platform is that when patients are getting so much value out of the program through, like you said, the reminders, through the feedback, through the education, they're so thrilled and more than happy to every now and then give you a bit of data back to the healthcare team, because they've received so much already. And I think the other thing too, Alan, is that for a number of our of the patient reported outcomes that we do collect, we also immediately give patients feedback based on the data that they generate. So not so much for the validated tools like the HOOS or KOOS, but when we're collecting other patient reported outcomes to track day-to-day progress. So let's say each day we're tracking daily pain scores or potential warning signs or symptoms of surgical site infections, and we can give patients feedback about, okay, like here's education on how to manage low level pain, or if your pain is like skyrocketed, here's the right number to call. Or maybe in some cases for patients in our partners who actually want to monitor patients and get alerts for patients who have skyrocketing pain, maybe a nurse reaches out to them because he or she gets alerted on Seamless. And so that there's this positive feedback loop of, okay, if I give my patient report outcome to the healthcare team, I either get feedback or I get a call if I fall off track, or I'm just getting value in exchange for the data. It's not a one-way value chain anymore. It's a bi-directional exchange of value, and that makes a huge difference on compliance for patients.
Yep. And it's personalized as well. So it's exactly what you're saying. They report symptom X. They're going to get specific education, specific tailored care based on what they're putting into the system. I think as well, just the idea that it's more granular. So the traditional format of collecting patient reported outcomes, like you said, maybe there's 6 surveys over the period of a year or something like that. Whereas on the system, tracking symptoms day to day, and then throwing in some of the validated surveys as well, you're able to collect a much more granular set of patient reported outcome, because you have day-to-day data from patients and you're seeing how it's changing over time, down to the day, for instance.
Absolutely. I mean, so imagine right now if all you did, let's say we're talking about a knee replacement patient. Imagine all you did was collect the normal KOOS survey, and you collected it, a few weeks pre-op, and then you collected it at, I think it's 6 weeks post-op, 3 months, six post-op, 6 months, 12 months. But in the post-op, early post-op phase, where the most issues can happen, you're only collecting it, once at, whatever, 6 weeks post-op. And if you're a provider who's using something like Seamless, and you're able to actually show across the first 30 days of recovery, here's how the daily pain score changes across the population, and truly map out, like, what does the actual recovery look like in an average patient, or then maybe slice and dice it. How does that change between a patient who has different demographics, or ages, or comorbidities, or different approaches to a knee replacement, different implants? You can slice and dice the data, but that is much more valuable to slice and dice if you can map out the entire pain recovery trajectory for a patient. That is so much more powerful than just, well, what's my pain at 6 weeks after surgery? But why not be able to show the entire, 30-day or 60-day recovery period? That is way more powerful. And imagine being able to do that not just for pain, but for opioid consumption, for range of motion for the knee, and all kinds of other metrics, Al. And it's just, the sky's the limit, and that's what we've seen with our partners.
Totally. And in addition, so, like you're saying, with those actual, reported outcomes from patients around anxiety or pain or range of motion, things like that. Taking that a step further, so it's not even just the quality of life type information, it's also important information for the clinical team. So let's say like compliance around enhanced recovery. We want to know, did the patients actually mobilize, or did the patients stop taking their blood thinners on time, and all these other protocols that patients are following for these new enhanced recovery after surgery models of care. And so drilling down into the actual compliance, and then seeing that on a dashboard, being able to actually monitor what's the population like in this enhanced recovery program. Is there a compliance issue perhaps? Is there certain protocols that we're sending out that patients aren't following? And if so, or if they are, what's the results from that?
Alan, that's a great point. So I think what's funny is historically people thought patient-reported outcomes, they thought about just functional status metrics or symptoms, so like pain or range of motion. But you're right. I think one of the things that we've actually really helped the industry to pioneer is the fact that compliance with instructions reported by a patient is a patient-reported outcome. Right. Our partners are collecting P.R.O.s, like you said. Did you do your pre-surgery chlorhexidine wash? Did you stop, eating at midnight? Did you do your day one exercises? These are patient-reported outcomes. But those aren't things that are encoded and validated surveys, right? But these are things that we've worked with partners to design and track, and that's a very powerful thing, especially to your point, Alan. Let's say we have insurers who decide to tie reimbursement to evidence-based models like enhanced recovery. Wasn't sure, wouldn't a great patient-reported metric be, did the patient do their carb-loading? That might be something that an insurer might want to know at some point, right? But no one's normally tracking that data, so why would you even think about that, right? But now we are. That's really interesting.
Yep. And then on top of, is the patient actually doing the protocol? Let's say the carb-loading drink, for instance. Are they actually taking it? And then is that carb-loading drink actually effective? And they can then measure that against, what is the actual outcome, the clinical outcomes for that patient. They can, slice and dice the data that way. You told me a story in the past from one of our partners who did pretty much exactly that. It was on the Impact recovery drink. Do you want to tell that story on the podcast, or?
Yeah, Impact might not like the story, but I'm sure Impact works in some organizations. But let's just say there was a certain drink that Rush was given to the patients for their enhanced recovery initiative, and they weren't sure, number one, if patients were even taking the drink. Number two, even if they were, was it making an impact on surgical site infections? And what they found using the patient-reported outcomes compliance tracking on Seamless was that 90% of patients were saying they were taking the drink. But then when they correlated that back to what's been the pun intended impact on on SSIs, they found no difference. And so that basically told them, like, look, there's no point giving patients the impact drink because it's not changing the metric that we want to improve. So they just use that data to make a decision to just stop, providing those drinks to patients and then focus their time elsewhere. And again, I'm sure in some organizations with different populations, things like that drink might help, but just wasn't true in this case. But that's only because they had that patient-reported outcome metric to help inform that decision. So, we're seeing all kinds of ways now that these granular data points that are being collected on digital engagement platforms is being used to change practice.
Mm-hmm. And exactly, and extrapolating that further, maybe there's a new pain regimen that we want to put in place, and so being able to capture the patient voice and in addition to trying out a new pain regimen, we can then see the data afterwards. We can look at the outcomes and see, was the compliance there? First question that should be always asked. And if the compliance is there, is it actually effective? And so we're able to use this digital patient engagement to really figure out, is there an impact from that protocol or whatever it is.
I think
another. Oh, go ahead, Josh.
No, I think the other neat thing is that in the past, if you wanted to, let's say, evaluate a new intervention and collect P.R.O.s, you would literally have to you design a new study, and then you'd have to decide, okay, we're going to start collecting P.R.O.s for this specific study. Well, imagine you had something like Seamless, and all your patients were on the platform, and every patient was regularly tracking P.R.O.s as the standard of care. And then let's say you introduced a new intervention, a new pain protocol. You wouldn't have to introduce P.R.O. surveys. Like, they're already being collected on Seamless. All you would have to do is just retrospectively check, okay, let's look at how the pain scores or the P.R.O.s results looked, before and after the new pain regimen, or for patients who did or didn't have it, however you want to slice and dice it. But we're already collecting all the P.R.O.s in perpetuity. So you wouldn't have to start introducing them again. It's like it's already part of the patient experience. You're getting the P.R.O.s, just slice and dice the data after. That's the power of having digital engagement. You don't have to think about collecting new P.R.O.s. You just collect them. They're there in the background. Like, how much faster can you do like research and quality driven? Like so much faster. It's incredible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I mean, obviously, for the purpose of that type of study, it would be tracked presumably inside their EMR, so they know which patients are taking the new protocol or whatever. But you can also do that within SeamlessMD as well. We can have a checkbox. This patient is on that new pain regimen. This one's not. And you can easily filter the data.
Integrate with the EHR, and we pull that data point and we sync it that way. So
yeah, exactly. And I think what else is neat is, you're saying to set it up, they're collecting P.R.O.s for the entire patient population. We're able to, standardize that. The other neat thing is, I think our partners have also standardized that. So we're collecting pretty much the exact same patient-reported outcomes at all these different sites across North America. And what's neat about that is you can then form different collaboration efforts between these different sites that are collecting the exact same patient-reported outcomes. Do you want to touch a little bit on what SeamlessMD is doing specifically in the collaborative space?
Yeah, so one good example that these partners have shared at conferences and whatnot. We have this really great multi-center cardiac collaborative, as folks from Baystate and Montreal Heart Institute and UAB and St. Francis Hospital Long Island and a few others soon that we'll be able to maybe share more publicly. But what's fascinating is that these centers are not only benchmarking a lot of very typical patient-reported outcomes, but because they're all kind of collecting daily granular patient-reported outcomes on SeamlessMD. So not just standard, validated surveys, but also, compliance with protocols, daily pain scores, daily opioid consumption, and all kinds of metrics. They are benchmarking way more patient-reported outcomes than any other, P.R.O. registry or collaborative, right? So if you look at a lot of the, I think orthopedic collaboratives, they might be benchmarking a preoperative KOOS survey or a 6-week post-op KOOS survey, but this cardiac group is benchmarking like day 2, patient-reported anxiety, day 3, patient-reported opioid use, day 5, everything, right? And the things that they've been able to, the insights to be able to generate are just really incredible. So for example, one of the things they've done recently is they've actually benchmarked, what percent of our patients get an opioid prescription at discharge. And they've extrapolated this data just from the patient-reported outcomes on Seamless about, whether or not patients reported getting an opioid prescription and how much. And so what you find is that among some very high-performing centers, there's like wide variation in percent of patients getting, opioids at discharge, and even some variation in total opioid consumption among their patients reported on SeamlessMD. And so, when you get these variations, it starts prompting these centers to start asking each other, okay, well, why are you prescribing more or less? What are you doing differently? How else are you controlling pain? Let's look at the pain scores. Let's benchmark the pain scores. How do those look different? Does that correlate to opioid use at all? And so it's creating all these unique opportunities for not just research, but also quality improvement by sharing best practices. And so it's just been a fantastic thing to see that they're really leveraging the data in a very novel way. And I think part of the reason that's possible is because they're actually collecting so many granular data points. They've really taken what it means to have a patient-reported outcome to the next level.
Yeah, totally. And just for folks to understand, how that looks and what is actually happening. Correct me if I'm wrong, but these partner sites are conducting like monthly conference calls where they're bringing their nurses onto the call. They're, the surgeons are on the call, and they're all kind of looking at the same dashboards because SeamlessMD has these collaborative dashboards set up. So, it's looking at any P.R.O. measure that they want to drill into. Maybe it's compliance for like mobilization, for instance, and we can see, what's your center doing versus our center, and you can really quickly identify who's the high performer in which category and which P.R.O. And like you're saying, it's a great way to ask questions, a great way to share best practices, even understand what the protocol differences are at the different organizations. Maybe there's some more like analog solutions that they have. I know one example, and I don't know if I can name names, but one example that we have, there was a partner who we were looking at mobilization of patients in cardiac surgery, and one center was mobilizing their patients almost a full day sooner than the other centers. And that obviously led to a big question, how's that possible? And it just came out over the phone. Well, we have this whiteboard system that we put up behind the patient bed in the in-hospital setting, and we check off whether they've done their 4 walks today. And it's a simple solution. It's really, it's analog. It's just a little whiteboard with a marker. But that type of question and that insight wouldn't have come up unless they had these patient-reported outcome dashboards and could collaborate on the results and monitor all those patient-reported outcomes together.
Yeah, and I think what's neat, Alan, is that historically the only benchmarking organizations had done, and this is true I think for most organizations still today, is let's look at the clinical outcomes and benchmark it. Let's pull up our NSQIP database and benchmark, complication rates and mortality rates and readmission rates. They're still important to do, but what's really interesting about patient-reported outcomes is that it's almost like some of these P.R.O.s are earlier indicators of success or failure. And so you're almost like being able to benchmark precursors to the clinical outcome. So to your point, early mobilization is correlated with length of stay and recovery. So if we're able to actually get patients mobilized earlier, then theoretically that has an impact on length of stay, right? Or if we're able to, benchmark patient compliance with carb-loading, that has an impact on length of stay and complications, right? And so if we're able to benchmark those things and then improve those patient compliance metrics, then we should see an impact on the lagging indicators, which is the actual clinical outcomes. And so I think what this group is doing is really, really novel. And I'm excited to see how other groups do something similar and go deeper beyond just the basic P.R.O.s and get into the weeds of daily granular P.R.O.s that we're able to collect.
Mm-hmm. And that group specifically, the cardiac collaborative, they presented already on their first, I think, year or first findings from the collaborative. I think they presented that at last year or 2 years ago, AATS.
Yeah, I think they've presented AATS, STS. They presented a lot of places. And this, I think we're going to expect to see lots of other specialties doing something similar in the next couple of years. It's just going to be the norm.
And I mean, just coming back to what is patient-centered care, it makes sense collecting these P.R.O.s on a very granular level, but to really capture the patient voice, that should and probably will be a very important step for incentive models in the future, and really just making a patient-centered care approach to all of our patient care that we're giving out. Do you want to touch on maybe the future of PROs and where we can take it? Just, I'm sure some folks have, their minds are racing already at the idea of patient-reported outcomes and the granularity that we can collect. But where does that mean? Where can we take that in the future?
Yeah, and I think there's lots of opportunity to leverage new technologies such as machine learning with patient-reported outcomes to have more advanced risk prediction in healthcare delivery. So in the past, Alan, the ways that we've used risk prediction and machine learning in healthcare is, well, we know what a patient's demographics and comorbidities and medical history are. We know whether those patients, let's say, got readmitted or died or had a longer length of stay. And so we could build out risk prediction models where if I gave you this patient's demographics and medical history, and let's say the type of surgery they're having, I could tell you, Alan, well, this specific patient has a 25% risk of readmission in the first 30 days after their heart surgery. But what we haven't been able to do is tell you, okay, well, what's the risk on day 5 or day 10 or day 15 in real time based on how they're actually recovering. Mm-hmm. And if we can't do that, then even if I know this patient has a 35% risk of readmission, like what do I do with that? I guess maybe I could keep a closer eye on them.
Yeah.
But it doesn't really give me any real-time guidance.
Right.
And so, one of the things that we're working on at SeamlessMD is, well, imagine we have all of that, historical data about past surgical patients, and imagine that combining with that data, we actually have the daily, patient-reported outcomes. Let's say we have daily data on symptoms and pain scores and incision issues during the recovery period. We put all of that into a model and we train that model. Well, imagine a future where if a nurse was monitoring a patient during recovery on Seamless, and instead of just getting an alert because the patient had a fever, which is what we do now, and by the way, it works, but imagine because of that model, we could say, okay, this patient who's had, 7 days worth of symptom data recorded on Seamless, based on that data and the model, this specific patient, because of those symptoms, because of their medical history, they have a 40% risk of readmission in the next 3 days. Ding, 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 you should reach out to this patient today. Like, that's the level of accuracy that we think we can build by leveraging patient-reported outcomes as part of real-time guidance, real-time monitoring. That's sort of the machine learning roadmap that we're actually building out right now. And that's, I think, really the holy grail of patient-reported outcomes. It's not about what happened. It's about using that to determine what will happen, and using P.R.O.s to actually drive more advanced monitoring in real time.
Mm-hmm. So it's definitely an exciting topic. I think patient-reported outcomes are important now to get to that point in the future. And just combining it all together, again, it's patient-centered care. So actually leveraging the patient voice to give patients better care, I think, is the goal. And collecting P.R.O.s with digital patient engagement seems to be one of the most effective ways to get to that goal. So I'm excited. I think it's really fascinating topic. And
I mean, it's maybe not quite as exciting as pickleball, but it's almost there.
Exactly. Well, I'll tell you this, Josh. Maybe next time on the podcast, I'll give another reported outcome on how my pickleball playing is going. But
well, make sure you use SeamlessMD to track that report outcome.
I will. I definitely will. This is great. I like this episode a lot. If folks on listening to the podcast, if you have any suggestions or questions or comments on this episode or for the future, drop us a line either on Twitter or on our website or wherever you found this podcast in the first place. But we'd love to hear from you. We know, we're certainly not the only ones in this space that are tackling P.R.O.s, and so we have our insights, but we'd love to combine them with everyone else and hear what you guys think as well.
Yeah, and tell us, do you want to hear more pickleball, less pickleball? you got to get that feedback.
Exactly. Whether people don't want to hear pickleball, I'm still going to talk about it. I think it's a fantastic game. So, all right. Well, Josh, we'll end it here. We're trying to keep it shorter again. So I think this is a great episode on P.R.O.s and the power of P.R.O.s moving forward.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Alan.
All right. Thanks, Josh. See ya.
Yeah.